Okay, so first of all, thanks for this invitation. So today we will talk about fractional viscoelastic models, but that's going to be actually the second part of the talk. In the first part of the talk, what I want to focus on is the theory of linear viscoelasticity. And why is that? It's because if we understand theory of linear viscoelasticity, then the fractional viscoelastic models are just going to be a subset or a generalization actually of that theory. So you don't need to learn anything more. So if you understand that one, then the fractional models are just going to fall as a consequence. So I guess by now I shouldn't tell you what rheology is. Maybe you can tell me what rheology is. So what is rheology now? Perfect. So you do have an example on your table. So I just brought you some silly putty. So if you want to just warm up your hands a little bit, because during the first part of the lecture, since it's a bit early in the morning, we are going to write together some notes. And then on the second part, we're just going to go through the slides. So you can play with it. You can see that if you just throw these silly, if you make a ball and then you throw it on the table, then it's going to bounce. If you just pull on it, it's just going to flow. So it's just an example of viscoelastic material. So I guess all the speakers from the previous sections have already given you lots of examples of why we want to study how materials respond to external forces and deformations. So I'm not going to go through them. So I thought, oh, can I just bring one more example that hasn't been mentioned yet? So the one that came to my mind was that about plant morphogenesis. So there is an interest in plant biology to study how plants grow and how they reach different shapes, from leaves to tomatoes or even for crop. So during one of my postdocs, I did actually work on plant morphogenesis. I worked on one simple model plant, that's Markantia. So we did do some experimental data. So we looked at how it grew, and then we wanted to make a model out of it. And to do that, you need to know the mechanical properties of these white edges. These white edges are what is called the cell wall. So with respect to animal cells, plant cells do have a rigid box. So they are enclosed within this rigid box. And that's the part that is going to dominate how the morphogenetic process develops. So this was just one example. Okay, so as I was mentioning, now we are gonna go through the theory of linear viscoelasticity. So if everything works, you should be able to see what I write. Cool. Perfect. So we'll do a very quick introduction of the theory of linear viscoelasticity. Okay, so what is our aim? So what do we want to achieve when we do this analysis? So the aim is to find a relationship between the applied force and the observed elongation. So we want to find this relationship between applied force and elongation. So what we do in practice is that we go in the lab, we take a sample, we pull on it, and we look at how much it elongates and what's the force. But that's going to be dependent on the sample size and the sample geometry. So we want to be a bit more generic. So actually what we want to find is a relationship between the stress and the strain. So what we want is a relationship between stress and strain. So for me, the stress is going to be sigma. No? I can see it on my screen here. Okay, it appears. Yes. Yes. So I'm just gonna make a drawing one second. So I want to remind you actually about two canonical behaviors that you have already seen. The first one is that of elastic material. So let's imagine we take a sample and we apply a force to it. We know the cross section of our sample. Again. So we can define our stress as, I guess you all know, as the force over an area. Yeah. Now when I press, then it goes. So what's the unit of a stress? Pascals. Good. So it's Newton over an area. So a force per unit area. Good. And it's not. So what about the strain? So if we take a bar of length L, we have applied this force. So now I'm just gonna do a cross-sectional view of length L. This is going to elongate by delta L. So our strain is going to be defined as the elongation over the initial length that I called L0. What is the dimension of the strain? It's dimensionless. Good. This is important. We will see why for the fractional one. So it's good to have all the dimensions in place. So if we do a ramp test, so we apply a deformation with a constant rate, what we will observe for a linear elastic material is a straight line with a slope that I'm gonna call K. And for me, K is what's known as the Young's modulus. The Young's modulus is gonna tell us how stiff a material is. So the higher it is, the stiffer it is. So the first relationship between stress and strain that you all know is that of sigma equal to K times epsilon. That's a linear relationship for a linear elastic material. So what I want to do now is to associate this mathematical relationship to a symbol. And I'm going to associate this to a spring, because that's what a spring behaves like. You could associate it to anything. And then we have a second canonical behavior, that is that of viscous fluid. What is the relationship between sigma and epsilon for viscous, purely viscous fluid? You've seen it yesterday. It's going to be dependent to the first derivative of the strain, where eta is the dynamic viscosity. But is actually mostly referred to as viscosity. And what are the dimensions of the viscosity? What is the dimension? Right, yeah, that's the Pascal times second. Just keep this well in mind, Pascal times second, because we will see what happens with the fractional ones. And of course, we want to associate also this mathematical relationship to a graphical symbol, because that's going to be useful later on when we want to make more complicated models. And what's the symbol associated to this mechanical behavior? Is that of a dashpot or a damper? Good. So we've seen we have these two behaviors. However, most of real materials, what they do is that they show both of these behaviors simultaneously. So such materials are known as viscoelastic. We have viscoelastic. So what are the phenomenological features of this class of materials? So we have three phenomenological features. Oh yeah, sorry. Sorry. So if we apply a constant stress, what happened to the strain? So we take a material, you apply constant stress, is it going to continue to elongate? So the strain increases. And that's what we refer to as a creep. Whilst if we apply, yes. Sorry?
And static viscosity also?
Yes, so that's part of fluid.
And what it means if it is static? Because I imagine
Sorry?
what it will mean if it is a static, because I only imagine to measure it in a dynamic.
Yeah, that's how it's the nomenclature. In fact, we always refer to as just viscosity.
Okay.
And then in textbook, you can find it as dynamic viscosity, so you know it's the same.
Okay.
But I'm gonna just call it viscosity.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay, so what happens when we apply a constant strain? What's going to happen to the stress? We apply constant strain, we keep the deformation constant. You've seen it yesterday. The strain decreases, yes? The stress decreases, and that's known as the relaxation. So the material relaxes, so it releases the stress. And then the third behavior, let's say, phenomenological aspect of viscoelastic material is that if we apply cycling loading, then if we apply cycling strain, the stress is going to be shifted in time. So we have a phase lag. And actually, these three phenomenological aspects, they do match to the three experimental tests that are done in the lab to characterize viscoelastic material. Those are the creep test, the relaxation test, and the third one is the dynamic test to obtain the G prime, G double prime. So what does the theory of linear viscoelasticity do? It does provide us some tools to extract from this mechanical test the material properties, so some unique numbers that are going to characterize the material. They give us this mathematical. So the aim when we do this study is that we want to find a unique relationship for each material between stress, strain, and time. So then we can predict the behavior of the material to any loading condition. And this unique relationship, how is it called? This unique relationship is called the constitutive equation. So when we talk about constitutive equation, we refer to a unique relationship that can be used for any loading conditions. And we will see why this is important. And we will see something that is actually missing in the literature. Because what we actually, most people do is they do perform one of these three tests. They fit a model, and that's it. But what you've done, you've just fitted the model. You haven't proved that that's a constitutive equation, that that equation actually describes how your material behaves. In order to prove that, you need to perform another test. You extract the material parameters from the first test. You use those extracted parameters. You ask your model, can you predict the response, for example, to creep? And that must match the second experiment set. If you don't do that part, you've just fitted your data. It's a good fitting function, but that can be anything. You could actually just make your own fitting function. I think this is important. In fact, you will see that when we wanted to prove that fractional models, and we'll see why they are good constitutive models, it was really hard to find in the literature a complete set of data, so both creep and relaxation, or relaxation and ramp, or anything, because normally you find just one test.
Is this because you cannot access all the times, all the frequencies? Is this a limitation in the measurements? Because in principle, if you know you have a perfect fit with zero error over the entire frequency range in oscillatory, this or there is something more fundamental.
Yeah, it's like it works really well in your fitted range, but what happens afterwards, especially for the fractional ones, we will see you can use like these springs and dashpots, and it's going to work really well in the spectrum where you fit. But as soon as you ask your model to predict outside the spectrum, it's going to fail completely. So basically it's going to work really well in that specific spectrum that you fitted. Yeah. I think I've deleted. Okay, that's fine. So as we were saying, the first test that most people perform is that of relaxation. It's one of the tests. It's either relaxation or creep. It depends on your setup. So what's the relaxation test? What do we keep constant in the relaxation test? The strain, correct. So we apply a strain and we look at how the stress behaves and what are we expecting? Something that increases, good, something that decreases. So remember that we are looking at theory of linear viscoelasticity. So if we apply a step that is double the previous one, what are we expecting? That also the response in the stress is going to double along the full range of time. And that's exactly what experimentalists also do to test your elastic limit, your linear limit. So you do the test at different strains, and then you'll see whether if you scale it is going to overlap or not. And then you'll find where the theory is going to fail. So we apply a stepping strain where h of t is my Heaviside function. Maybe I got it. So the relationship between stress and strain is going to be g of t times epsilon. What is g of t? That is the relaxation function or relaxation modulus. And for us, at the moment, it's just a generic expression. And we will see then what's the shape of this g of t. So we said that we are looking at linear materials. So we've already seen one property that if we double the applied load, also the response is going to double. What's another consequences of being linear? So if we apply, exactly. So if we apply a load that can be split up in different loads, then also the response is going to be the sum of these responses. And we will use this principle in a minute. So the second test that you've seen is that of the creep. So what do we keep constant in the creep? Okay, I've already written. Oh, you don't see it. The stress. So we keep the stress constant. And what's going to happen to the strain? Is it going to increase or decrease? Increase. So it's going to flow. And again, also because we are limiting ourselves to the linear materials, if we double the stress, also the response is going to double. And the relationship between stress and strain is going to be given by J of t times the applied stress. What is this J of t? Is what we call the creep compliance. Now we have all the tools to derive a relationship between stress and strain for the materials to be able to predict their response to any loading condition. We take a generic strain history. And we assume that the material is at rest before time zero. And that's a good assumption. We split the response in small intervals, and we focus ourselves on one interval that goes from t minus tau to t minus tau plus delta tau. As we were mentioning before, since it's linear, we can describe this response. First of all, let's write the strain. So the strain is going to be epsilon of tau times the Heaviside function of t minus tau minus t minus tau plus delta tau. So the increment in stress due to this little element is given by epsilon of tau times g, which is the relaxation function of t minus tau minus the relaxation function at t minus tau plus delta tau. And now we know that if we take the derivative of the relaxation function, the limit for delta tau that goes to 0 is t minus tau plus delta tau minus g of t minus tau over delta tau. So we can rewrite the increment in stress as minus epsilon of tau times the derivative of g of t minus tau over delta tau. So this is the increment in stress due to that little element. But if we want to know the stress response at a given time, we need to sum up all these little elements up to time t.
Understand?
Yes.
So in this plot, if you had to plot the, so basically what you, sorry, let me rephrase. So what you wrote up there is that your delta t, delta tau is so small. You can imagine that your sequence of strains is a set of steps.
Yes, very small steps.
Very small steps.
Yes.
Any requirement about the stress? Choosing tau? I know this is, you can choose it as small as you want,
Yeah.
but from a practical point of view?
More practical. I mean, you do have some problems when you have singularities in the responses.
Okay.
That you would do. In fact, the dashboard is one of the problematic. Because the smaller you go, you still have the singularity. So in that one, you need to do some fixing. So that's the singularity, which is mostly given by the dashboard. So like the Kelvin void, that's going to be problematic in the relaxation because of that problem. Yep. But there are ways somehow numerically to fix it. It's not perfect. But okay, so if we do integrate the contribution of all these elements from 0 to the time t that we want to compute the stress at, of epsilon of t times the derivative of the relaxation modulus of d tau in d tau. Just bear with me 1 second. We have one extra term, which is the relaxation modulus times epsilon of t. So this, okay, this second term, the one where I put the cross, arises from the fact that if we are computing the stress at time t, we also have the contribution of epsilon of t at the time where we want to compute the stress of. So t minus t, so the g of t minus, let me call it t star, the time we want to compute the stress at t minus t star is going to be 0. So g of 0 of epsilon of t star. So that's just the contribution of the time where we are computing. Then if we do some integration by parts, what you obtain is that sigma at time t is given by the integral between 0 and t of the relaxation function of t minus tau times the derivative of the strain with respect to tau in d tau. And this is the fundamental equation in linear viscoelasticity, which is also known as the Boltzmann integral.
Yeah. In the second equation there, is there a d tau missing?
Sorry?
In the second equation there, is there a delta tau missing? The units don't seem to match.
In the second.
In the right-hand side of the differential, it should be just dg, not dg over d tau.
The second equation we see,
the d sigma is equal to
d
minus
sigma equal to minus epsilon dg dt.
Yes.
Just dg, right?
It's the derivative of the.
Yeah, but the d tau is a bit too much there.
so you don't need the d tau or the denominator.
Okay. Yes.
I think you need a d tau in the numerator.
And then when you
It's the
rewrite it in the
derivative, yeah.
integral, you add the d tau above.
So change of variables.
Okay. And then you can do the same for the strain, so for the creep. So if you do the same for epsilon, so if you have a stress history, your strain history is going to be given by the integral between 0 and t of this time the creep compliance with respect to the first derivative of the stress. So if you know the relaxation function, the creep function, you can predict the stress and the strain response to any stress and strain loading history. So since the relaxation function and the creep function do describe the same material, are they somehow related? Or are they two completely independent functions? They should be related since they are describing the same material. How they are related? To do that, basically, we take the Laplace transform of equation 1 and equation 2. And what we obtain so if we take the Laplace transform of equation 1, we have that sigma of s, where s is a transform variable, is equal to s times the relaxation modulus in the Laplace transform times epsilon of s, and equivalent for the equation 2. So if we equate these two relationships, we find that g of s times j of s is equal to 1 over s squared. Also, this one is an important relationship because for some fractional models, you might be able to find one of the two analytically. So what do you do with the other one? You compute it numerically using the Laplace transform. Okay, here we did make the assumption that the system is at rest before time zero. So that's correct when we talk about the dynamic test. So when we look at the dynamic test to obtain the complex modulus, then we do need to integrate from minus infinity because we do have a continuous function. So assuming that the system is at rest before time zero is an acceptable conditions. Yes, so you need to, yeah, you might have the singularity problems though for some, yeah, from a numerical point of view, yeah. So for some of them, yeah. So there's actually a big problem for some models from a numerical point of view, that's zero step. Okay, so as we were mentioning right now, so the third test is that of the dynamic test. So, and is when we apply a sinusoidal stress or a sinusoidal strain. So let's assume we are going to apply a sinusoidal strain, so sigma of t, epsilon of t, and we write it as a complex number because that's going to be useful to derive the complex modulus. It's epsilon of 0, which is our amplitude, times e to the I omega t, where e I omega t is a complex number. So what you do, you go and you substitute this applied loading history into your equation 1. But as we were saying right now, so now we're talking about a continuous sign, a periodic loading. So we cannot assume anymore that the system is at rest before 0. So we need to integrate between minus infinity to t. Again, of g of t minus tau times the derivative of the strain in the tau. So since we are a bit short in time, I'm not going to go through the derivation, but we can have a look at it later if you want. But what you will obtain if you do so is an expression for sigma of t, which is what we call g star. Oh, let me call it immediately as g prime of t plus I g double prime of t times epsilon of t, where our g prime and g double prime are the storage and the loss moduli. Just bear in mind one thing, that prime and double prime is not a derivative, because sometimes people confuse it as the derivative of g. It's not, it's just a convention to call it g prime and g double prime. Okay. But if you want to actually go through this derivation, we can do it together. It's just that we're short in time and I want to focus a bit more on the fractional ones. Okay, I just put graphically because I thought it was useful. Yeah, to have a graphical representation of these sinusoidal loadings. How does it look like? So we do apply for example, a stress that is sinusoid, and for an elastic material, what we expect is a strain that is in phase. What happens for a fluid material? We do apply again a stress and the strain is going to be shifted by 90 degrees. So we have a phase lag of 90 degrees, what is called delta. And for viscoelastic material, this delta is going to be between 0 and 90 and depends on the material. Perfect. So all the equation we've seen so far, we did talk about G and J and G star, G prime, G double prime. But those are functions. How can we determine these functions? There are different methods to do it. One, as engineers, we do like a lot of graphical methods. So what we do is we use these springs and dashpots models. That's also because they resemble a lot of electrical circuits. So they do have lots of analogies. As we were saying, this symbol, which is the spring, is associated to sigma that is linearly related to the, let me call it, the zeroth derivative of the strain. And for the dashpot, the Newtonian liquid, the stress is related to the first derivative of the strain. These two unit blocks can be combined in any way. So the simplest way to combine it is to put them in series. We're going to look at the first two simple examples in series and in parallel for the traditional models, because when we look at fractional ones, they're going to work exactly in the same way. So what happens when you put two elements in series? They will both experience the same stress. So the stress that is on the dashpot and the stress that is on the spring is going to be the same. But the resultant strain is going to be the strain given by the dashpot plus the strain given by the spring. So we can also take the derivative of this function. We write that the derivative of the total strain is given by the derivative of the strain on the dashpot plus the derivative of the strain on the spring. We do know the constitutive relationship of these unit blocks. So we can find the relationship between the derivative of the strain and the stress. Here. So one important point I want to make here. So we can rewrite this equation and put it in a nicer way where we put all the stresses on one side and all the strain on the other side. So all of these are graphical, let's say, representations. Underneath these graphical representations, there is always a differential equation that relates the stress to the strain, and that's our constitutive relationship. This is just a way to help us understand how they behave, to give us some intuition. But what we are really interested in is this one. This is helpful, but then we need this to compute. So these two little notes is that when we have elements in series, they always have the same stress, and the strain is going to be the sum of the two strains. How can we derive the relaxation and the creep compliance for this model? We just solve the differential equation. Or if we want to find the relaxation modulus, we do solve it for a constant stress, for a constant strain, and we do obtain an exponential relationship that relates K and eta. This is a characteristic time that is really useful when we talk about viscoelastic model, and that's called the characteristic relaxation time. That's going to tell us how fast or how slow the stress is going to decrease. Okay, yeah, we do have it, yeah. And one thing I want to point out, the stress is going to decay up to 0. So when we do have one dashpot in series to any block, in this case we only have a spring, we could have a much more complicated network, that's always going to go back to 0. So it's going to give us a fluid-like material. So when you look at your experimental data and you see that the relaxation goes to 0, that's already telling you that you might have a network that is in series, and one of the elements of the series is going to be the dashboard, because that's going to dissipate everything. Let's look at the creep. So to obtain the creep compliance, what we do is we're going to solve the equation for a step in stress. And again, what we find in this case that the J, so if we plot the J, is going to increase forever. So it's going to flow forever. Of course, this is within the mathematical theory, so that's not true in real life. But so if you do see that your experimental data, when you do a creep, does not plateau, that's already hinting you to this sort of network organization. And again, you can also do it for the G prime, G double prime. And you can either substitute in your differential equation the oscillatory strain, or you can take the Fourier transform. So you can see here that at short time scale, the first element that is going to give the response is going to be the spring. We will see this one later also again, that is important. While a long time scale, the dashed line, which is the G double prime, which is the storage modulus, is higher than the, which is the loss modulus, is higher than the storage modulus, which means that it has a fluid-like behavior. So all these three functions, actually this is also the correspondence for the J prime, J double prime. They're all interrelated, so there are not different functions. They should, if you derive the parameters K and eta from one experiment, they should be valid for all the other ones, if that's a constitutive equation. Let's look at the other canonical organization that's in parallel. So in parallel, what happens? It happens that the two elements, they do experience the same strain. So the strain on the spring and the strain on the dashboard is going to be the same. But what we don't know is how the stress, the total stress, is going to redistribute between the two branches. So in this case, we know that the total stress is going to be given by the sum of the stress on the branch of the spring, or the first branch, and the stress on the second branch, the dashboard. In this case, it's slightly easier. So we know that the stress on the dashboard is given by eta times the first derivative of the strain, and then the stress on the spring is just K times epsilon. Epsilon is the same because both of the elements are experiencing the same strain. So we simply substitute it here, and we obtain directly the constitutive equation, the differential equation associated to this graphical representation. So when we have elements in parallel, they do experience the same strain, and the stress is given by the sum of the stresses on the two branches. Now you have all the tools to make any models. So how do we derive the function, the expressions for the relaxations, the creep compliance, and the complex modulus? We do follow the same. So we do solve the differential equation for a step in strain. As I was mentioning before, this model is simple, but it does have a problem in the relaxation response because it has a singularity. So it's a little bit, let's say, nasty from a computation. So it's not really realistic, let's put it this way. But it's, from a pedagogical point of view, it's useful to understand how two elements work in parallel. When we have the response of for the creep modulus, we do apply a step in stress. And as I was mentioning before, okay, actually I haven't mentioned before. Yeah. So when we have two elements in series, we've seen that that's going to give us a fluid-like behavior. Let's ignore the singularity. What do we have as a relaxation response in the long term, we do have a final plateau of value k, which is the k of this spring in parallel. So, yeah.
Never impose a heaviside step function. There's always a ramp rate.
Yeah, so we do put a ramp with a very high rate.
Yeah, okay.
That's what we also do like computationally wise to deal with it. But then when we need to plot the mathematical response, we need to. But yeah, so in the library we do have that, let's say, shortcut. Yeah, so as a final plateau, we do have the k, which is given by the spring in parallel. So if you do a relaxation test and your stress doesn't go back to 0, but it reaches a different value, that's already hinting you that you will have a branch in parallel, and that plateau is going to be given by the spring. Also, when you do a creep test, if it doesn't flow forever, but it does plateau, that's also telling you that you have a spring in parallel. So when you pick a model, it's not that you go to your computer and you try the one that fits the best. So if you look at the qualitative behavior of your data, that's already hinting you what model you should use. And again, you have for the G prime, G double prime, you solve the Fourier transform or you apply the oscillatory stress. So what you can do now, I haven't done it, but you can do for fun, or if you want to test, you can derive the differential equation for this, which is the standard linear solid model, which is another very commonly used configuration. And you can use the tools that we've developed for the Maxwell and the Voigt, because we have 2 elements in series, so we apply the conditions we did for the Maxwell, but then we have 2 branches in parallel, and we apply the conditions that we did apply for the Kelvin-Voigt. Again, you solve for the step in strain. So what you see is that the final plateau is given by the value of the spring that is in parallel, whilst the dissipation, the rate of dissipation, is given by K1 over eta 1. Sorry, actually it should be eta, which is actually the decay, the relaxation time of this branch. Okay, now we are gonna stop with equations for 5 minutes. So we're gonna look at some experiments. So what do we do with all these K, J, G expressions, springs, dashpots? Let's try to apply it to a real scenario. So what we are mostly interested in, at least in my work, I'm mostly interested in epithelial tissues. So epithelial tissues are found a bit everywhere. So it's one of the simplest tissue in our body. So during embryo development, you can see that epithelial cells, they do undergo large deformations. So we are interested in understanding their mechanical response, because we want to understand how morphogenetic processes develop. And then epithelial tissue line most of our internal organs. So they lie the stomach, the gut, all blood vessels. They have an inner layer of a single layer of epithelial cells, the eye as well. And when this epithelial layer breaks, then we have quite severe consequences. So what happens is that you can have a brain aneurysm, you can have an aorta aneurysm, you can have, like in fragile skin pathologies, it just break under normal conditions. So there is quite an interest in understanding the mechanical response of epithelial cells. And this is the work I started when I was doing my postdoc in Alexandre Kablas' group with Guillaume Charas at UCL. So what Guillaume developed in his lab was this very ideal system. So what was previously done was to test epithelial cells on top of an extracellular matrix. So you just pull both of these materials together. But then you need some techniques to deconvolve the response of the tissue from the response of the substrate. So what they did develop was this system where you have two rods, actually it's better here, two rods, one that is fixed, that is rigid, and one that can deflect. Then in between the two rods, you put some collagen, and on top of the collagen, you seed some cells. You let them grow for a couple of days, and they become confluent, and they directly attach to the two rods. Just before the experiments, with an enzymatic digestions, you remove the collagen underneath, and what you are left over is just with a single layer of epithelial cells that is directly attached to your testing machine, to your testing device. Then you put it in your testing machine, and then you can apply a displacement on the rigid bar. And by looking at the deflection of the flexible bar, you can infer the force that has been applied. Yes.
Are also covered in collagen. Otherwise, like how the tissue attached to
it does attach to it.
like
Yeah.
without any kind of.
Collagen. Yeah. For the MDCK, there are some other cells that still epithelial ones that we did try actually. The one for the eye, for example, they don't like it so much. So we need to do some pre-treatment of the rods to attach them. But the MDCK, they just attach. Okay, so we want to study the mechanical properties of this material. So what can we start with? Yes, so we do just a relaxation test. So we apply a constant stress, a constant deformation strain, and we look at how, so this is a top view, and this is a single layer of epithelial cells. And so we apply a step in strain, and we look at how the stress decays. Okay, what can you tell me? What type of network, springs dashpots, do we need to capture this response? So the stress doesn't go back to zero. So what do we need? We need a spring in parallel to something that decays. So what does give us a decay? A Maxwell, yes. So what we need is a spring that is in parallel to a spring and dashpot configuration, and that's the standard linear solid model. So it does have all the qualitative features of our experimental data. Of course, this data has been smooth. It's a bit more noisy in real life. Perfect, so let's go and fit this model. Perfect, so the black line is again the experimental data, and the red line is the fitted model. So it seems that it can capture the final plateau. Good. So we remove the plateau and we plot the same data in a semi-log scale, which means that if we have an exponential behavior, we should see a straight line. And we do see it, and the model captures it. Let's plot it in log-log. Do you think the model is working? So if we have a straight line in log-log, what does it mean? It's a power law. But this model gives us an exponential. So it cannot capture a power law. So we do have a problem. So we have this initial behavior that is at short time scale that cannot be captured by this model. Is this just a problem that we have? So it's something we need to take care of, and because no one else has it? Well, actually not. These power law behaviors are quite widespread in biological materials. So mostly all cells do show it, at least all the one I've seen so far. So here is a review from Ben Faber's group, where they've plotted several cell types, several tissues, and they all show power law behaviors. It is something that only biologists encountered. Actually not. We have like the gum, bread dough, collagen fibers, cheese, ice, even asphalt, even bitumen. So it's a problem that is a bit more broader. What do all these materials have in common? They are complex because they have several processes occurring with different time scales. That's what they all have in common. So this behavior is a challenge for the community. How can we capture them? Okay, I'll go back to this plot. What can you see? What all these models have in common in their G and J response? So they all give us an exponential. It doesn't matter how you combine them, it's always going to be an exponential. So what people thought was perfect. So let's put several of them in parallel. I haven't talked about the spectrum. So the spectrum shows us what are the characteristic times of the system. If we plot the spectrum of a power law, that's a straight line. It's the black line. Oh, sorry, the spectrum is this. So this is the relaxation, the stress and time. So that's, and the spectrum is also the power law. Let's try to plot it with one Maxwell model. That's the blue line. It's not really doing a great job because we are just sampling one characteristic time. Okay, let's try with two. So we're sampling the spectrum with two characteristic time, better. Or the qualitative behavior is captured quite well. We've sampled in a log scale, we've sampled our spectrum and we have a nice fit. So it seems working. But what happens if we use the model outside this spectrum? It's going to fail because we haven't sampled that. What means is that we would need an infinite series of these and to fit the full spectrum to be able to reproduce this power law. So this gave rise into the literature into fitting with several parameters. Several parameters that then it's hard to relate them to something physical and to discriminate between all of them. So the other approach that was also being used is to use empirical expression. So I come up with an empirical expression, someone else comes up with his own, but then it becomes hard to compare each other. This is just a summary of what we've discussed. So let me tell you one thing. Fractional models are not going to tell us where the power law is coming from. Let me highlight this. Fractional models is going to be a very useful tool to capture, to model the power law, to be able to handle it. But it's not going to tell us the source of this behavior. So I just want to make this statement clear. Yeah, yeah. Time, but we don't know where.
You don't put your hands in the microscopic picture of your sample. You don't know what that that relaxation time means, right?
So, and why did I want to say that statement? Because that's exactly how we're going to go through these two slides that are a bit heavy, but let's see how we do it. So this is what we observed experimentally. Experimentally, we observed that G, our relaxation functions, follows a power law. Good. If we want to find the response in stress of this material that has this relaxation modulus to any strain, we use the Boltzmann integral. And we know where it comes from, linear approximation and everything. So we substitute this function into this integral. We're not doing anything, just we observe that experimentally. Let's put it into this integral. And this is what we obtain. Yeah, we haven't done anything difficult so far, just a substitution from what we observed experimentally. Now, let me start from a bit of maths. So, if we want to integrate a function n times, this is what we obtain. Thankfully, we have a theorem that comes into our help, which is the Cauchy formula for repeated integration. So all of these integrations can be summarized as one integral. N in this case is an integer number. This same expression can be generalized for n that is non-integer. So I call it alpha. That's a real number. So it can be 0.1, 0.2, it can be anything. What requires us is that the factorial numbers that we have in the second expression here now becomes the gamma function. The gamma function is the generalization of the factorial. And I've just put here as a reminder how it's computed. Now we just do a substitution of variable. We call alpha as 1 minus beta, and we call our f of tau as the derivative of the strain. We haven't done anything, just starting from integrating a function n times. Now we have these two, let's say, tools, these two expressions. Sigma, that is coming from the Boltzmann integral, and there's let's say, repeated integration. So we can rewrite the Boltzmann integral. So A is just a constant. Gamma of 1 minus beta is also a constant. So we rewrite it as sigma is equal to a constant times this integral, repeated integral of 1 minus beta. Yeah, they look the same. It's just a constant. And then we have the fundamental relationship. So we have that the integral of a plus b can be the integral of a times the integral of b or of f of t. So the integral of the derivative is the function itself. So we have what we are left is with the c beta, which is a constant, times the integral of minus beta of epsilon of t. The integral of minus beta is what mathematicians called fractional derivative. So we can rewrite that sigma is the constant c beta times the fractional derivative. So what have we done? We started from what we observed experimentally, and we obtained a mathematical tool to deal with it. We have not explained it. But now we have a tool that is able to capture the power law behavior. Okay, so the fractional calculus is a bit complicated. So it's a big branch of mathematics. And there is not one definition of fractional derivative. They like to have several. It's okay, but we focus on one. So if we put this integral between a, it becomes our 0. So we integrate from 0 to t because we assume that our system is at rest. That's what is called as the Caputo fractional derivative. This is why I put a C here. So what we will be using as a definition is the Caputo's fractional derivative. And then in the literature, you find lots of definitions. Two observations. First of all, this derivative is non-local. So one main difference between what we think as the second derivative, that's a local operator, you always here need to integrate from 0. That's one downside. There are some ways to deal with it. It's like, how long is the memory? So that has been studied. So based on the system, do you always need to integrate from 0 or not? Of course, if you have a step, that's your answer. Second important aspect it's a linear operator. What it means is that everything we've seen so far is valid. So we work in exactly the same way, but now we don't have only the first or second derivative, but the first derivative, but we have the 0.1, 0.2. So now we don't have a spring and a dashpot only, but we have a third unit block that we call it spring pod or Scott-Blair. Is this spring pod something new? Actually not. Scott-Blair introduced it in 1940s when it was studying bitumen. So it did exist, but it has never been extensively used. And we will see at the end why, or one possible reason why that hasn't been used. Actually, yesterday, if you remember, Mehdi showed you already this element with a different shape. So he showed you in one of his slides these elements. This is a triangle. That's the spring pod. So these are the two representations you can find in the literature. I mean, I draw it as a rhomboid, but you can also find it as a triangle. It's still the same. Okay, can you already see one limitation or one disadvantage? K, what is the unit of K of the stiffness? Pascals. What's the unit of the viscosity? What's the unit of C beta? It's Pascal to the second of, it should be of beta. And that's called a quasi-property because it doesn't have a physical sense. But you can sort of get, if beta is 0, then it becomes a spring. So that's going to be a stiffness. So that's going to tell you how stiff it is. If beta is 1, it's going to be a dashpot. So it's closer to a viscosity. So some people call it the firmness of the material. But what it physically is, if you have an answer, we're happy to hear it. Okay, but as we were saying, it's a linear operator. Everything works as before. So we can solve this equation for a step in strain. And this is what we obtain. So we have a relaxation function that follows a power law. And again, we can do it through the Laplace relationship between G and J. We can find the creep compliance that also follows a power law. I think the best way to understand the spring pod is to look at it qualitatively. So let's look at the relaxation response. If we pull on a spring, that deforms and it stays at the same stress level. What does a dashpot do? It dissipates everything immediately. What does a spring pod do? Let's take a spring pod with exponent of 0.3. So it dissipates, starts to dissipate. Let's take it 0.5. It dissipates even more and faster. Let's take the 0.7, 0.9. So basically what the spring pod does, it interpolates your behavior between that of a spring and that of a dashpot. But look, it will always go back to 0. That's another important aspect to keep in mind. I think what is even more interesting is to look at their the creep recovery response. So spring, we apply a constant stress, and then we unload, and everything goes back to 0. Dashpot, we apply, then we leave it, and it stays there. What does the spring pod do? It loads like a spring. So this is for 0.3, and then it unloads. And for 0.5, again, it gets closer to the behavior of a dashpot. And then for 0.9. But also here, remember, it will always go back to 0. Even the smallest 0.99999, eventually, it will go back to 0. It will dissipate everything. So you can also see it from the step response if you write it analytically. That is this one. The same study, you can do it for the storage and loss moduli. So one little thing to keep in mind is that in this case, as before, we need to integrate from minus infinity because that's a cyclic loading. And that's not called Caputo's derivative anymore. So that's called the Liouville-Caputo's formulation. So that's a different formulation. So if we derive the G prime, G double prime, what we obtain is, again, a power response. So the red line is, again, that of the storage modulus of a spring, the loss modulus of a dashpot. What happens when beta is 0.5? Both the storage and the loss moduli are the same. When beta is above 0.5, so 0.8, 0.9, then the storage modulus, which is the green one, is higher than the loss modulus is higher than the storage modulus. So it has more a fluid-like behavior. When beta is closer to 0, for example, the 0.2, then the storage modulus is higher than the loss modulus. So it has a solid-like behavior. And then you can derive the phase shift, which is a function of your beta. Okay. But normally, these power law behaviors are not everywhere in time. They are normally focused on the short time response. So what we need is to combine this spring pot, as before, with other elements. How do we do it? Exactly as we did before. So let's take one as an example, the two spring pots in series. Again, this is valid, so the strain is the sum of the two strains. The stress is given by the constitutive equation of the spring pot, so we can derive the two strains by integrating these functions. And therefore, we can simply write it as the sum of this one plus this one, and this is what we obtain. And that works as before. We haven't done anything differently. Just that now we have a minus beta rather than 1. So one complication is that then we need to solve this differential equation, which is a fractional differential equation. So they give rise to a bit some unusual, let's say, functions, as this one, which is very common as a solution for the fractional models. That is the Mikla-Leffer function, which is an infinite series. Mathematicians have fully studied this function. So it's fully characterized. We know their asymptotic behavior. We have all the algorithms computationally to compute it, so that is fast.
Say that using the fractional derivatives in the Mittag-Leffler, that you're replacing one infinite series for another. Like if you have to have infinite many Maxwell modes, now you've got infinitely many.
Yeah, so we need somehow to get this infinite.
Yeah.
But that comes into that, and then we have only two parameters to deal with.
I gotcha.
Yeah. Perfect. So let's just give some intuition, which basically relates to what we have already seen. So if you remember, when we have a model in series where we have a dashpot with a spring, the Maxwell ones, we have the spring, the dashpot that reacts, the spring that reacts at short time scale, and then the dashpot at long time scale. So let's put two spring pots in series where alpha is greater than beta, which is exactly this case. This is a special case. So we have the spring that reacts at short time scale. So the relaxation modulus will have a slope of beta. And then at long time scale, the slope is going to be that of alpha, of the higher power element. What happens when we put them in parallel? The opposite, as for the Kelvin void, exactly. So the spring is going to play a role at long time scale. Again, the element with the low exponent is going to play a role at a long time scale. So this is to tell you that when you look at your experimental data, that's already hinting you about what you will need, whether you need a series or a parallel configuration. I'm going slightly faster on this one because now I want to go to, so I said that there are some disadvantages of the fractional ones, but there are also some advantages. So let's look at some of them. So one of them is that several empirical functions that you can find in the literature, they can actually be described as fractional models. So we can fit them within the same framework, so we can then compare the parameters. And the fractional models allow us to capture complicated behavior with fewer parameters. And one other advantage, I haven't put it here because I want to focus later. So here is an example. For example, you have the double power law in G prime, G double prime, which is often seen in cells, like in most muscle cells or kidney epithelial cells. This was fitted with an empirical function that is nothing than the spring pod, the two spring pod in parallel. And then another empirical function you find a lot is the structural damping models. It has this expression. If you do some mathematical, like a manipulation of this expression, you can rewrite it as this one. And this one is nothing rather than the spring pods in parallel to a dashpot. So it's basically this one where one of the dashpot has been one of the spring pod has been specialized to a dashpot. This was another empirical function that was used, and it was used by us. That's what we started as a first. So we have an exponential times the power law. Okay, let's try to build this model together. So we do have a final plateau. So we need a spring in parallel to something that dissipates. This dissipates as an exponential. So if we want a power law, what should we substitute? We can substitute the spring with a spring pot. And this configuration springs dashpot with a spring pot gives you at short time scale a power law, because when we have two elements in series, the one with the lower power is the one that is going to react the first, which is going to be beta, because this one has power of 1. And then the dashpot is going to kick in, and that's going to give us the exponential behavior. So when we came up with this configuration, that's the rational thought behind it. And of course, this is associated to a differential equation. And for this differential equation, you can solve the relaxation modulus. This we were lucky, so we could find a closed form solution, but we don't have a closed form solution yet for the creep compliance. But mathematicians are working on it. They said they have it. So I think that is beyond my skills. And then the same model was actually used to fit the storage and loss modulus for the PDMS at different time from the gelation point. So what we did was to fit the same model at different time of gelations. And we looked at how the parameters changed and if it sort of made sense. So at gelation point, you can see that G prime, G double prime are the same. In fact, that corresponds to a beta, which is our red line, of 0.5. So the storage and loss moduli are the same. What does physically mean? I don't have an answer, so maybe someone with a more insight. And then we can see that the K, which is our green line, it doesn't give any contribution up to the gelation point. Then after it starts to gelify, to solidify, to polymerize, it increases significantly. And also the same is true for the viscosity. So it becomes extremely viscous past the gelation point. In fact, we can also see that the storage modulus is below the loss modulus before the gel point, whilst the storage modulus is higher than the loss modulus. So with the same model, we could describe the full range of responses. So the other benefit I was mentioning was that of fitting data with less parameters. So we did get some data from the literature for example, articular chondrocytes that were fitted with the 3 parameters. Here we do have, again, 3 parameters, but if we compare the quality of the fit of the fractional ones is much better. The same for the tomato mesocarp. This was an AFM study. And yeah, these are just, sorry, because I'm a bit short of time, I want to go to the next benefit, which I think is a bit better. Because so far what we did was just to fit one experimental data set. But what did I mention before was that that's just a fitting function. If this is a constitutive model, we need to be able to make predictions. And this is what having a fractional models allowed us to do for the epithelial cells that we were not able to do before. So what we did was, these are experimental data, not smoothed. As you can see, it's a bit noisy. So we fitted these curves with the fractional models, and then we used the extracted parameters to predict the creep response. And as you can see, of course, the parameters do have some range, so the K and eta and C beta. And you can see that the prediction for 2 levels of stresses is quite good. But, yeah.
That you find for this?
0.3. So then you find an average and you need to fix it. Otherwise, you're not able to see it up because you have different ranges. That's one side effect. And then the other data set we did find in the literature, where we had both relaxation and creep, was that of single collagen fibrils. So we did fit, again, here there was only one experiment, so we tried our best. We did fit the relaxation curve with the fractional models, and we used the exactly same parameters to predict the creep response. So this is not another fit, this is a prediction using the parameters extracted from this fit. So we can see that this is a constitutive model. Another benefit of these fractional ones is that it gives rise to a much more complicated set of qualitative behavior. So let's go back to these fractional models. That's the one we have characterized the most. So we have one relaxation qualitative behavior. So we have the spring pot, the power law, the exponential, and the plateau. And we have one characteristic time, that is the relaxation time. When we go to creep, that becomes a bit more complicated because, as you can see, we can go from having just a plateau, so it plateaus, or it does have an inflection point before the plateau. And that's because now we have 2 characteristic times that play a role. And that, depending on the relative position of these 2 characteristic time, you can observe 2 completely qualitative different behavior. So if you were to see one experiment with this behavior from the same material, maybe treated pharmacologically, and then another one like this, you may be tempted to say they have different constitutive equations, but actually not. With the fractional ones, the same model does describe both of these qualitative behavior. And that's exactly what we observed when. So this is the control scenario. So we also predicted the ramp up to 30% deformation because then it becomes highly nonlinear. So this is the prediction of the ramp response using the same parameters that we obtained from the fit of the relaxation. And then we did treat the samples pharmacologically to alter the cell contractility. So the cell do contract. So we removed the cell contractility. We fitted the relaxation response. And we can see that there, we can see that their creep response is different. So it does take more time. So we didn't really see a plateau at the same level. So, but we did see what looked like an inflection. These data are a bit more noisy because the monolayers are a bit more, let's say, variable. And with the same parameters, then we did extract the ramp response as well. And we did have a good agreement for biological data. And then we tried to revisit some published data as well. So this is a paper from Ben Faber's group, where they did attach a bead to a cell, to a fibroblast, and with magnetic tweezer, they pulled on a bead several times, and they look at the relaxations. So we thought, and they interpret this as a plastic behavior, as a plasticity effect. Plasticity means nonlinearity. We did revisit this analysis with the spring pod in mind. And in the literature, we found that when you apply a local stress to a fibronectin-coated beads, what the cells does is that it reinforces locally the response. So from the previous analysis of the monolayer, we did attribute the spring in parallel to the cell contractility. But if you're just applying it locally, the cell contractility, you don't see it fully. So we were expecting not to have the spring in parallel. But then we see that there is a bit of recovery, and that might be due to this local response. So we were able to match the qualitative behavior of the of what was interpreted as a plastic nonlinear behavior. What are we saying? Are we saying that this is a linear behavior? No, but what we are saying is that maybe now we need to do some more experiment to discriminate between these responses, because the same could have been interpreted as a linear response. Sorry, I'm running out of time, so if you give me just 2 more minutes. So what hopefully we've given you today is an introduction to the theory of linear viscoelasticity. We've looked at the fractional models that are still linear. So if you have clear in your head the theory of linear viscoelasticity, everything is still the same, nothing changes. So we've seen their advantages of we compare experimental data, we compare results across groups, we can make predictions with the same constitutive equations. So why are they not used? One downside is that the mathematical formalism and numerical implementation is not so straightforward. So if we try to derive for all of them the G prime, G double prime, we can see that and the G and the J, we can see that the math becomes quite messy easily. So that might have been a reason. So what we did with Alex Cablas with one of the PhD student Lois was to develop a open source software that we will see later in the week in the afternoon, where all these models have been implemented. There are both the traditional models and the fractional ones, and you can just freely use it to fit your data. So thank you for your attention, and sorry for the running out of time.